You will be gone by nightfall.
This is my home, Josiah. I will not go. It's beautiful, isn't it?
We built this, Mercy. It's ours.
Mercy Whitfield was 29 years old when she stood in the frozen dooryard of the only home she had ever shared with a husband and watched her belongings piled onto a borrowed cart in the gray hour before a Nebraska territory dawn. She had been cast out by her husband's older brother, Josiah Whitfield, who claimed the homestead was his by blood and custom now that Daniel was 6 weeks in the ground. Thrown from a spooked gelding on a ridge above Larkspur Hollow. All Mercy owned in the world, once the cart was unloaded onto the frozen road, was $9 folded into a handkerchief, a wool coat gone thin at the elbows, and a trunk that had belonged to her grandfather. With 2 of those $9, on a bitter gray afternoon in the last week of October, 1888, she bought the old flood watchtower that leaned above the bend in the Coyote River. A structure the whole county called cursed and worthless, sold at auction because no one else would raise a hand for it. It seemed the most foolish purchase a desperate woman could make. But sealed somewhere above, behind boards no one had disturbed in 17 years. Waited something that would not only save Mercy Whitfield from the winter closing in around her, it would restore an entire town that had forgotten what it once was owed. Settle in, and let us tell you the story of Mercy Whitfield. If you're watching tonight from somewhere that feels forgotten, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. Mercy had not been born to hardship, though hardship had found her early and often. She came into the world in a river town in Ohio, the only daughter of a schoolteacher mother and a father who worked timber rafts down to the mills. And by the time she was 7 she had lost them both, her mother to a fever that swept through in a single terrible autumn, her father some months later to the river itself, which took men the way it took driftwood, without ceremony or warning. She was raised after that by her mother's father, a quiet, exacting man named Elias Cobb, who mended clocks and cut keys and repaired locks in a narrow shop that smelled of oil and brass shavings. And who took his granddaughter in without a single word of complaint, only a nod, as though he had been expecting her all along. Elias Cobb was not a warm man in the way some grandfathers are warm, but he was patient in a way that Mercy came, over years, to understand was its own kind of love. He taught her to sit still at a workbench for hours, to listen to the small ticking complaints of broken machinery until they told her exactly where they hurt, and to never ever assume that a thing was worthless simply because it looked tarnished, cracked, or forgotten by everyone else. The whole world is full of clocks nobody bothered to wind, he used to tell her, turning some rusted pocket watch over in his weathered fingers, and half of them still keep perfect time, if a person has the patience to look. She learned to read tiny markings, hairline scratches, the almost invisible clues that told the story of where a thing had been and what it had once been worth. She learned lock mechanisms, the logic of hidden compartments, the particular satisfaction of finding what other people had given up looking for. And she learned, most of all, that worth was not something the world assigned to a thing, it was something a thing carried inside itself, waiting for someone patient enough to find it. When she was 22, she married Daniel Whitfield, a homesteader from Larkspur Hollow who had come east to sell cattle and instead found himself unable to leave without her. Daniel was easy where his brother Josiah was hard, generous where Josiah counted every coin twice, and for 7 years Mercy built a life with him on the dry, wind-combed plains of the hollow that felt, for the first time since her parents died, like something permanent. She kept the ledgers for their small herd, mended harness leather with the same careful hands her grandfather had trained, and taught herself the particular geography of the land around the river bend the way another woman might memorize scripture, the places where the grass grew thin over old riverbed, the low places where fog gathered strangely on autumn mornings, the exact bend where the old flood tower stood black and skeletal against every sunset. A structure everyone in the hollow had simply stopped seeing, the way people stop seeing a scar on a familiar face. Daniel used to joke that his wife knew every inch of the county better than the county knew itself. She never imagined that knowledge would one day be the only inheritance she had left, because Josiah Whitfield made certain that nothing else of Daniel's would pass to her. The fall, when it came fast and came cruel. Daniel died in early September, and by the time the ground had properly settled over him, Josiah had already ridden out from his own claim 20 miles north with 2 hired men and a deed he swore Daniel had signed over to him years before. In case of exactly this misfortune, a deed Mercy had never once seen, never once heard mentioned in 7 years of marriage, and which she suspected, though she could never prove it, had been drawn up in the weeks after Daniel's death rather than years before it. The town circuit judge would not sit again in Larkspur Hollow until spring, and Josiah knew it. He told her plainly, without cruelty in his voice but without softness either, that a widow with no children and no living kin of her own had no standing to hold land that belonged, by every custom he cared to recognize, to the nearest living Whitfield man. He gave her 9 days to gather what she could carry and be gone before he brought his own family out to settle in. Mercy went to the small clapboard church, to the 2 other widows in town, to the storekeeper who had known Daniel since boyhood, and found sympathy everywhere and help nowhere, for Josiah Whitfield was not a man anyone in Larkspur Hollow cared to cross, being the largest supplier of grain to the mill and cousin, by marriage, to the very water baron who controlled the only reliable well for 6 miles in any direction, a hard, watchful man named Absalom Renner who charged what he pleased and answered to no one. Mercy left the homestead on a gray October morning with her grandfather's trunk, her mother's wedding ring, and $9 that represented the entire remaining value of 7 years of a life she had built with her own 2 hands. She was, by every measure the town understood, a woman with nothing, cast out before the first hard frost, with winter already sharpening its teeth on the horizon. She might have taken the stage east and started over somewhere her name meant nothing. Instead, on her second night sleeping above the livery stable for the price of sweeping its floor, she overheard 2 men laughing about the county auction scheduled for the coming Saturday, parcels and structures seized for unpaid taxes, sold for whatever coin anyone was foolish enough to offer. And chief among the jokes was the old flood tower above the river bend, which nobody in 3 counties would take even as a gift, on account of it being cracked, useless, and, according to the older of the 2 men, lowering his voice with theatrical relish, haunted by the last soul who'd kept watch in it. A woman nobody quite remembered anymore except that she'd vanished from the tower one autumn without a trace, sometime before the war. Mercy did not believe in ghosts, but she believed absolutely in her grandfather's conviction that the world was full of things nobody bothered to look at twice. She went to the auction with $2 silver set aside from her 9, watched the auctioneer struggle to get so much as a chuckle out of the gathered farmers when the tower came up. And when he finally, mockingly, asked if anyone would give him $2 just to be rid of the paperwork, Mercy Whitfield raised her hand before she had entirely decided to do it. The tower, and the quarter-acre of scrubby riverbank beneath it, became hers for $2 and the cost of the deed filing. Several men laughed outright. One woman, an older widow named Ruth Pruitt who ran the boarding house, only looked at her with something that might have been pity or might have been recognition, and said, "Well, child, at least it's a roof, such as it is." It was, in fact, barely a roof. The tower stood 4 stories of gray, weathered timber above the river bend. Built some 25 years before as a flood and fire watch station when the Coyote River still ran wild and unpredictable through the hollow. Before it changed its course in the drought of 1871 and left the tower standing sentinel over ground that no longer needed watching. The lower 2 floors had rotted through in places, birds nested in the rafters, and the whole structure leaned very slightly westward, like an old man favoring a bad hip. But the upper floors, when Mercy climbed the interior ladder with a borrowed lantern on her very first evening as its owner, were drier and sounder than she expected. Built of a harder wood that had weathered better, and on the 3rd floor she found the remains of what had clearly been a keeper's room, a rusted stove, a narrow cot frame, a shelf of tools gone to rust, and, tacked to the wall beside the single shuttered window, a faded, hand-drawn map of the river bend and the hollow beyond it, marked with small symbols she did not immediately understand. She slept that first night wrapped in her coat on the third floor with the wind singing through gaps in the boards, and told herself, as she drifted toward sleep, that at least it was a roof. Such as it was, and at least it was hers. It was on her third morning in the tower, while running her hands along the walls in the way her grandfather had taught her, feeling for irregularities the eye would miss. The way one might feel for a hairline crack in a watch case, that Mercy found the false panel. It sat low on the northern wall of the fourth floor, the topmost room, disguised by decades of grime and a warped board that looked, to any ordinary eye, exactly like every other warped board in that ruined structure. But her fingers found a seam too clean, too deliberate, and beneath it a small iron latch worn smooth by hands that had opened it many times before her. Behind the panel was a shallow compartment, dry despite the tower's decay, containing a tin document box, a leather-bound journal gone soft with age, and a brass surveyor's compass wrapped in oilcloth as carefully as a mother might wrap an infant. Mercy sat on the floor of that high room with the winter light coming thin and gold through the shutter slats. And she opened the journal with the same patient reverence her grandfather had taught her to bring to any sealed thing, and she read the name written inside the front cover in a strong, careful hand. Selah Winters, Keeper, Coyote River Watch Station, since the spring of 1861. The name meant nothing to Mercy that first afternoon, but the deepening of the mystery began almost immediately, because as she turned the journal's brittle pages by lamplight over the following days, she came to understand that Selah Winters had been no ordinary tower keeper. She had been hired, according to her own careful entries, in the years before the war, when the Army Corps of Engineers had commissioned floodwatch stations along the unpredictable Coyote. And she had been chosen, an unheard-of thing for a woman in that place and time, because the engineer overseeing the project, a man named Colonel Ashworth, had tested a dozen local men for keenness of sight and steadiness of observation and found none of them equal to the widow Winters, who had lost her own husband to a flash flood on that very river 2 years before and had, in her grief, spent so many solitary hours watching its moods that she understood its language better than any man for 50 miles. Selah Winters kept meticulous records of water levels, wind patterns, and something else entirely, something she recorded with increasing excitement across nearly 2 years of entries, which was her private, painstaking survey of the underground water table beneath the hollow itself. She had noticed, long before anyone else troubled to look, that a particular stretch of low ground east of the tower never quite dried out even in the driest months. That certain grasses grew there that grew nowhere else nearby, and she had taught herself, through patient trial and a borrowed engineering manual, to read these signs as evidence of an underground spring, a true aquifer, running beneath ground that at the time belonged to no one in particular, unclaimed commons land at the edge of the young settlement. What made Mercy's breath catch, reading by lamplight with the wind moaning outside the shuttered window, was the journal's final third, where Selah Winters's careful, factual entries gave way to something closer to alarm. She had gone, in the autumn of 1863, to the town's founding committee with her survey and her findings, hoping the commons land would be formally protected and the spring developed for the whole settlement's benefit, particularly as the war years had made water scarcer and tempers shorter across the territory. But a man on that committee, she named him plainly, without flourish, as though she had known even then that the name would matter to someone someday, a man named Cornelius Renner, had quietly filed a private claim on the very parcel she had surveyed within a week of her presentation, using details from her own report, and had begun, before the ink on his claim was even dry, to fence the land and speak of it as his family's rightful property by right of improvement. Selah Winters's final entries described her fury, her attempts to bring the matter before the circuit judge, and her growing fear that Cornelius Renner's influence in the young settlement was already too great for a widow with no standing to overcome. The very last entry, dated the 11th of November, 1863, read only, "I have hidden what proof I have where only a patient I will find it. If the town will not protect what is rightfully its own, then it must wait for someone willing to look twice at what the rest of us stopped seeing." Selah Winters vanished from the tower sometime in the following weeks. And no record Mercy could later find ever explained where she went, or whether she went at all, or whether the men who by then controlled the settlement's water simply preferred that nobody ask. Mercy understood, sitting alone in that high cold room with the compass in her lap, exactly what she was holding. The document box contained Selah Winters's full survey, her hand-drawn maps of the underground water table with precise measurements and markers, and, folded separately, protected in a second sheet of oilcloth, a certified copy of the original Commons designation for the parcel east of the tower, stamped by the Territorial Land Office in 1862. A full year before Cornelius Renner ever filed his private claim. It was, in short, proof that the land Cornelius Renner's descendants had fenced, guarded, and profited from for a quarter of a century had never rightfully been theirs at all. And that beneath it ran water that a drought-stricken, winter-fearing town desperately needed and had been paying dearly to a Renner ever since, because the current keeper of that fenced parcel and its single developed well was none other than Absalom Renner, Cornelius's grandson, the very man whose influence Josiah Whitfield had leaned on to help drive Mercy from her own home. It did not take long for word to spread through Larkspur Hollow that the widow who'd bought the cursed tower for $2 had been seen climbing to its top floor with a lantern every evening for a week. And it took even less time for that word to reach Absalom Renner himself. He came to the tower on a cold, bright morning in early November, riding alone, and stood at the base of the leaning structure calling up to Mercy with a friendliness that did not sit naturally on his features, offering to buy the tower and its scrubby quarter-acre back from her for $10, then $20. A sum so far beyond the property's worth that Mercy understood immediately she had found exactly what she suspected she had found. When she declined, politely but firmly, his friendliness cooled fast, and he reminded her, in a voice pitched for her ears alone, that a woman alone with no standing in this town would find the coming winter very hard indeed without the goodwill of people like himself who controlled the well that watered half the county's stock. It was, though he never said so plainly, a threat, and Mercy recognized it as one. And something in her, some steadiness her grandfather had built into her over years at his workbench, settled rather than trembled. She had learned long ago that a person who offered $20 for a $2 ruin was not protecting his pride. He was protecting a secret, and she now held the other half of it in a tin box on her fourth floor. The town, when Mercy finally brought her findings before them, did not receive her warmly. Ruth Pruitt believed her almost at once, having harbored her own quiet doubts about the Renners for years, but many others, dependent on Renner's goodwill for their water and their credit at his store, looked at Mercy Whitfield, a penniless widow with no kin, no standing, and a suspiciously convenient discovery, with open suspicion, wondering aloud whether she had forged the documents herself in some desperate scheme, or whether grief and hardship had simply addled her judgment. Josiah Whitfield, hearing of the commotion, rode into town specifically to declare, loudly and in front of the general store, that his brother's widow had always been a fanciful woman prone to imagining things beyond her station, and that the town would do well to send her packing before her wild claims stirred up trouble that would cost honest men their credit and their water access. For several days it seemed the whole weight of Larkspur Hollow's comfortable arrangements, and every person's fear of losing what little security the winter demanded, would simply close over Mercy Whitfield's discovery like water over a dropped stone, leaving no trace at all. Absalom Renner, sensing the town's hesitation, grew bolder, threatening openly to shut off well access to any family who spoke further with that tower woman, and for one long, cold evening Mercy sat alone on her fourth floor wondering whether Selah Winters's careful decades-old proof, and her own $2 gamble, would simply die the same quiet death her predecessors had. But Mercy Whitfield had learned patience from a man who mended clocks for a living, and she did not panic, and she did not retreat. Instead she went, methodically, the way her grandfather would have approached a stubborn lock. To the one authority in the territory that even Absalom Renner could not intimidate, she rode 2 full days to the Territorial Land Office itself. The very office whose 1862 stamp appeared on Selah Winters's certified document, and there a patient clerk confirmed, after searching through dust-thick ledgers, That the Commons designation was genuine, recorded, and had in fact never been legally superseded, meaning Cornelius Renner's original claim, and every claim descending from it, had been fraudulent from its very first day. The clerk, moved by the story and by the evident care of the original survey, agreed to issue Mercy a certified copy of the record and a letter confirming the office's findings. To carry back to Larkspur Hollow as evidence no local influence could quietly bury. She returned to the hollow 4 days later, cold to the bone and nearly out of coin, and brought the territorial letter before the town's assembled council in the schoolhouse on a night when the first real snow of the season was beginning to fall outside the windows, dusting the dark ground the way it does when winter finally means what it has been threatening for weeks. The revelation, once it could no longer be denied or dismissed, moved through Larkspur Hollow like a long overdue thaw. Absalom Renner, confronted with a territorial letter he could neither bribe nor intimidate into silence, tried at first to bluster, then to bargain, offering to simply lower his water prices if the town would let the matter of ownership quietly rest, but the council, emboldened now by proof rather than rumor, would not be bought off so cheaply a second time. The land east of the tower, spring and all, was formally restored to the Commons designation Selah Winters had fought for a quarter-century before, and a town committee, with Ruth Pruitt insisting, over some objection, that Mercy Whitfield sit upon it, began the work of developing the aquifer into a public well that would belong to Larkspur Hollow itself, free to every family regardless of what they could afford to pay Absalom Renner. It was not a swift process. Wells take digging and money takes gathering, and the first hard frost had already silvered the grass by the time the committee broke ground. But Mercy, using both her grandfather's patient methods and Selah Winters's careful old measurements, was able to show the diggers exactly where to sink their shaft, sparing the town weeks of guesswork and expense it could not otherwise afford, and by the second week of December, water rose clean and cold and free into a public trough at the edge of the hollow. With half the town gathered to watch it come, their breath rising in the freezing air like something close to prayer. Absalom Renner, stripped of his monopoly and exposed before the whole county as heir to a stolen claim, found his standing in Larkspur Hollow diminished in ways no threat of his could reverse. Several of his own tenant farmers, no longer beholden to his well, quietly moved their custom elsewhere, and the quiet justice of it needed no dramatic reckoning, only the plain, ordinary sight of people no longer afraid of him. As for Josiah Whitfield, word of his sister-in-law's role in the town's deliverance reached him within days. And whatever pride had let him cast her out before winter now had to sit uneasily beside the plain fact that Larkspur Hollow owed its water. And very likely several lives come the hardest weeks of the season, to the very woman he had turned away with $9 and no home. He did not apologize outright, men like Josiah rarely do, but he rode out to the tower himself in late December, and without much ceremony returned to Mercy a small portion of the homestead's grazing land along its eastern edge, muttering something about a debt he supposed he owed his brother's memory, which both of them understood to mean something closer to the truth. And so it was that Mercy Whitfield, who had been cast out before winter with $9 and a trunk of her grandfather's tools, found herself by the deep cold of January not simply surviving the season but rooted more firmly in Larkspur Hollow than she had ever been as merely a dead man's widow. She kept the tower, repairing it slowly over the following spring, and though she never lived in grand comfort, she lived in a small, sound cabin built near its base with lumber the grateful town committee insisted on providing, and she was known from then on not as the fanciful widow Josiah Whitfield had mocked, but as the woman who had looked twice at a $2 ruin everyone else had stopped seeing, and found inside it the thing an entire town had forgotten it was owed. She kept Selah Winters's journal on a shelf in her own small home for the rest of her life, and told her story to anyone who asked why a grown woman would spend $2 of her last $9 on a leaning, condemned tower nobody wanted, and her answer, every time, echoed the words her grandfather had given her at his workbench years before: the world is full of things nobody bothers to wind anymore, and half of them still keep perfect time, if a person has patience enough to look. She never forgot the cold morning she stood in the dooryard with nothing, and she never forgot, either, the strange mercy of her own name, which she came in later years to feel had been given to her not by accident but as a kind of quiet promise, that mercy, once shown, tends to find its way back around. The way water always finds its way back to the surface, however long it has been buried, however many people have forgotten it was ever there at all. Thank you for spending this quiet hour with Mercy Whitfield and the tower that gave a whole town back its water. If her story moved you, we'd be grateful if you shared it with someone who might need reminding that overlooked things, and overlooked people, often carry more worth than the world is willing to see at first glance. Before you go, we'd love to know, what is a time you found real value in something everyone else had written off as worthless? Tell us in the comments below. We read every one, and we love hearing where our stories find you. Until next time, stay close.